So I want to talk about oppression, okay? So the word oppression is not a synonym for discomfort or suffering or inconvenience or disadvantage, deprivation or hardship or powerlessness or obstacle. Actually, it's a synonym for all of those. There is built into every form of oppression a sort of violence, often a silent violence, one that is hard to see from the outside because it doesn't always involve shouting or physical harm. But behind the quiet facade, there is always the threat of open violence somewhere down the line. This is a key factor that distinguishes mere wrong from oppression. For when it is oppression, there is always a threat of further violence and or harm behind any more minor preliminary injustices, especially if the individual or group dares to challenge the injustices done to them. And so an inbuilt Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an article called Three Ways of Meeting Oppression. And he says, oppressed people deal with their oppression in three characteristic ways. One is acquiescence, to submit. The oppressed resign themselves to their doom. They tacitly adjust themselves to oppression and thereby become conditioned to it. In every movement towards freedom, some of the oppressed prefer to remain oppressed. He points out the slaves, the Egyptian slaves, when Moses tried to liberate them. There is such a thing as the freedom of exhaustion. Some people are so worn down by the yoke of oppression that they give up. A few years ago in the slum areas of Atlanta, a Negro guitarist used to sing almost daily, "Been down so long that down don't bother me." This is the type of negative freedom and resignation that often engulfs the life of the oppressed. But this isn't the way out. To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. Thereby the oppressed become as evil as the oppressor. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. The oppressed must never allow the conscience of the oppressor to slumber. Religion reminds every man that he is his brother's keeper. To accept injustice or segregation passively is to say to the oppressor that his actions are morally right. It is a way of allowing his conscience to fall asleep at the moment the oppressed fails to be his brother's keeper. So acquiescence, I hate that word, submission, while often the easier way, is not the moral way. It's the way of the coward. The Negro cannot win the respect of his oppressor by acquiescence. So Martin Luther King, I'm just going to use submission. It means the same thing. So the Negro cannot win the respect of his oppressor by submitting. He merely increases the oppressor's arrogance and contempt. Submitting is interpreted as proof of the Negro's inferiority. The Negro cannot win the respect of the white people of the South or the peoples of the world if he is willing to sell the future of his children for his personal and immediate comfort and safety. A second way that oppressed people sometimes deal with oppression is to resort to physical violence and corroding hatred. Violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle, but in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. It is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for everybody. The old law of an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than to convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends by defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. A voice echoes through time, saying to every potential Peter, put up your sword. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations that fail to follow this command. So that's two ways, right? Submit, use violence. Now, he's going to say use nonviolence, aggressive, in-your-face nonviolence, militant nonviolence. So he says that the American Negro and other victims of oppression succumb to the temptation of using violence in the struggle for freedom. Future generations will be the recipients of a desolate night of bitterness and our chief legacy to them will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. Violence is not the way. The third way open to oppressed people in their quest for freedom is the way of nonviolent resistance. Like the synthesis of in Hegelian philosophy, the principle of nonviolent resistance seeks to reconcile the truths of two opposites, the submission and violence, while avoiding the extremes and immoralities of both. The nonviolent resistor agrees with the person who submits that one should not be physically aggressive toward his opponent, but he balanced the equation by agreeing with the person of violence that evil must be resisted. He avoids the non-resistance of the former and the violent resistance of the latter. With non-violent resistance, no individual or group need submit to any wrong, nor need anyone resort to violence in order to right a wrong. So that's Martin Luther King's. So he basically breaks it down to three different levels, right? You either submit, which kills yourself, kills your own humanity, your own soul, and it doesn't do, it doesn't bring about a change in your conditions. It also makes the oppressor or the violent person more arrogant, more confident. So you must resist, but not to do it violently. He says violence is not the answer. You need to go in a nonviolent manner. Now he's talking about in general the oppression of black people. Well, what are specific things that people can do in order to fight oppression? Because there's lots of ways people can be oppressed. People can be oppressed in prisons, in mental institutions, in households, underneath an oppressive government, and plantations and slaughterhouses. I feel like these are very clear cut. There's oppressors, and then there's the oppressed, and then there are those of us who seek to be free. So here is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela had started out with nonviolence, but eventually, said that wasn't working. And so they considered 4 types of violent activities: sabotage, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and open revolution. For a small and fledgling army, open revolution was inconceivable. Terrorism inevitably reflected poorly on those who used it, undermining any public support it might otherwise garner. Guerrilla warfare was a possibility, but since the ANC had been reluctant to embrace violence at all, it made sense to start with the form of violence that inflicted the least harm against individuals: sabotage. Because it did not involve loss of life, it offered the best hope for reconciliation among the races afterward. We did not want to start a blood feud between white and black. Animosity between Afrikaner and Englishman was still sharp 50 years after the Anglo-Boer War. What race relations would be like between white and black if we provoked a civil war? Sabotage had the added virtue of requiring the least manpower. Our strategy was to make selective forays against military installations, power plants, telephone lines, transportation links, targets that would not only hamper the military effectiveness of the state, but frighten National Party supporters, scare away foreign capital, and weaken the economy. This, we hope, would bring the government to the bargaining table. Strict instructions were given to the members of the MK that we would countenance no loss of life. So that's what Nelson Mandela went ahead and... So that's oppression sort of on a large scale. Well, what do you do with individual, ways of oppression? You take a look at all the different tactics that they had used for torture. They would waterboard people, they would slap them, they would insult them, humiliate them, yelling at people, living in conditions, just even renting. Every month you have to pay 60% of your income for something that you don't get to keep. And so there's lots of different ways that oppression can take place. I want to talk about specific individual oppression. How do you deal with that individual oppression? So I'm going to mention internalized oppression. A person who's being oppressed, like Martin Luther King said, you could adopt it for yourself. So if you adopt that oppression for yourself, then you actually begin to look at the oppressor looks at you. And that's probably true on big scales. But when I was talking about Nelson Mandela essentially said sometimes you do need to fight fire with fire. Now, the bad thing about fighting fire with fire is that it could escalate and make, the world blind. An eye for an eye makes the world blind. But to Saint Louverture, the American Revolution, these were incidents of when the oppressed were using violence in order to achieve their goals. Now, internalized oppression, when people are targeted, discriminated against, or oppressed over a period of time, they often internalize, believe, and make part of their self-image, their internal view of themselves, the myths and misinformation that society communicates to them about their group. Exploited peasants might internalize the ideas that they can't do any other kind of work, that their lives were meant to be as they are, and that they're worth less than people with wealth or education. Women might internalize the stereotype that they're not good at math or science. People of color might internalize the myth that they're not good workers. When people from targeted groups internalize myths and misinformation, it can cause them to feel, often unconsciously, that in some way they're inherently not as worthy, capable, intelligent, beautiful, good, etc. as the people outside their group. They turn the experience of oppression and discrimination inward. They begin to feel that the stereotypes and misinformation that society communicates are true, and they act as if they were true. This is called internalized oppression. So that impression might, it's like, I've been down so long that I don't mind being down. So you're just like, oh, you've resigned yourself to the situation. You've said, oh, well, who gives a shit? I'm going to accept, I'm just a slave. I'm just going to be a slave, and I'm never going to change my circumstances. So you've actually sold your dignity. You sold your humanity out. You don't even respect yourself. When you don't even respect yourself, how can you get other people to respect you? This comes from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had said that a person can only feel pity for another human or creature for so long, and if they never show any power for themselves, then you just give up. They don't even respect themselves, so how can you keep fighting for someone that don't even respect themselves? And so that Frederick Douglass also says that the level that you submit to will be the level of injustice that will be perpetuated upon you. So that's big news. That's big. The level that you submit to will be the level of injustice that will be put upon you. Some people want to say, we have different experiences, life experiences with dealing with certain people. But essentially, I'll give you one example. I saw this little dog, and this little dog, they was just playing around, so this isn't a serious thing, but the little dog was being very protective of his owner. And so the owner's friend, this is just for an experiment, was pretending to kick the owner. And then the little dog started running after him. And then, the one who was kicking the owner eventually ran away. And the little dog, it's only 1/10 of the size, right, of the person who was playfully kicking, but, doing it for the example, that he would run away. And he would run away, then he would stop, and then the dog would stop too. But then as long as the person that was pretending to kick kept on running, the dog kept on running after them, because he said, I gotcha. You submitted to me. You submitted to my yelling and barking, and now you're running away. And clearly, the dog barking, it is saying that it wants to do some harm. Like, yeah, get away, get away, get away. And so I think that's a good example of the level that you submit to, is the level of injustice that will be perpetuated upon you. Clearly, the person wasn't actually afraid of this little tiny dog, but as long as they kept running away, that empowered the dog to keep on chasing. Now, actually, the dog was in defense, right? In defense of of its owner. And so by being in defense of it, in a way, it was doing something very righteous. But it was using threats? It was using yelling. And is that how we resist? I mean, those are ways to resist, right? If there's injustice, then I feel, well, that's just the example of oppression. The level that you submit to is the level of injustice that will be perpetuated upon you. This comes from Frederick Douglass, because if you accept your condition of life, that you're just a slave, well, they're going to treat you like a slave, and they're going to treat you like a slave for the rest of your life. Okay, so if you are a slave and you're on a plantation, the whole society actually, reinforces that entire relationship. It could very much seem like it's a hopeless endeavor to ever fight against your conditions, and the best thing you could do is to cope with it. And see, these are some internalized oppression survival strategies. Appeasing. You could appease the slave master. Caretaking of agent group members. Care about one another after they had just gotten, lashed. Staying silent or attempting invisibility, pretending you're not there, not saying anything. Withdrawal from or avoidance of agent group members. Isolation. spacing out, disassociating, numbing, hypervigilant, scanning, interpreting everything in the social environment as a threat. So these are targeted or internalized oppression survival strategies. This is what people could do to, and that's how they cope with it. Okay, so what can you do? What are some things that you can do? Well, I'm going to post all these dealing with oppression links in the comment section. But this guy was pretty good. He's all glamorized, got his hair all did, and it's a professional look at video. So he says, do know that it's not about you, okay? So do not internalize what the oppression looks at. It's something about them. They want to oppress for some reason. It's them. Stay focused on the positive. Improve your communication skills. Take the high road and lead by example. Those are things that you do need to accomplish. So again, no, it's not about you. Stay focused on the positive, improve your communication skills, take the high road, lead by example. Now, a list of don'ts. Don't try to change them. Don't try to change them. People will want to be there. Don't try to change them. Unfortunately, I feel like if there is an oppressor and the oppressed, and the oppressed says, hey, oppressor, don't oppress me no more. Let's be equals. By being equals, that actually is a constitute an act of love, because it gets the oppressor to gain a conscience, to seek to understand, and to become a better person. But if they're not able to convince that oppressor to be a better person, then it's probably best for the oppressed to get out, to do something different. So don't try to change them. Don't get hooked. Don't get hooked on just their thinking and the oppression. Don't invite them to social functions thinking that you could be their friend and then eventually they'll change their way of life. Don't accept their behavior as part of your life, and don't feel sorry for yourself. So again, don't try to change them. Don't get hooked. Don't invite them to social functions. Don't accept their behavior as part of your life, and do not feel sorry for yourself. You can't feel sorry for yourself because you have to fight. You got to stand up. So if you feel that good that is within you, if you feel that person, that humanity is being destroyed, don't give up. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Keep resisting. Because if you give up, then you don't even respect yourself. But you got to keep that alive, because that's the only way you're going to keep on going forward. You have to, never feel sorry for yourself, but keep the fight alive. Keep that about you. You could become physically ill if you say, well, I'm a nobody because that's what the oppressor says, so who gives a crap about my life? Your life matters. Everybody's lives matters. So those are some specific goals. It's not about you. Stay focused on the positive, improve your communication skills, take the high road, lead by example. Don't try to change them. You could, that actually constitute an act of love by trying to change them. By trying to change them, that it could escalate into violence. And if it escalates into violence, and then it just, I believe, if when two people are yelling at each other, or if they're fighting, that both of them could look like assholes, right? One person could have just came over there and just punched your kid in the head, and then you're sitting there punching them. And if somebody comes up on the scene and they see you just hitting this guy, they're kind of like, what are you doing? Why are you hitting this guy? Well, he hit my kid. Okay, well then that means that you're justified in doing so. But it's ugly. It's an ugly thing, right, to hit somebody else. And so some people are like, well, be all positive, be positive. I think being positive is a good thing, to say I can do this, I can be optimistic, but you also got to be realistic too. So, just because two people are arguing or two people are fighting, you can say both y'all are assholes and try to be neutral, but you actually took the position of the oppressor, because the one person hit the guy's kid. If he had hit the guy's kid, then that means he was the asshole, he was the aggressor, and he should be behind bars, right? He should actually be punished for that. So even though that the person was hitting the other guy, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was in the wrong. So, there are going to be difficult people in our society, not just the one that as you progress through life, there will always be encounters with difficult people. Rather than feeling sorry for yourself, make a commitment to improve your skills so you can deflect, reject, or walk away from negativity in your life. Anne Frank actually taught me this, and this is, Anne Frank was very honest. She was in her diary, so, she didn't hold back. But she said, if you feel like you're weak, then why would you resign yourself to your weakness? Why wouldn't you train your character to better fight for better circumstances? Why would you do that? Why would you accept, oh, I'm weak, I can't do anything about it? And she didn't understand that. You got to keep that part of yourself, and you got to keep the fight alive. You got to keep. You can deflect, reject, walk away from that negativity in your life. And when you discuss oppression, know that you're revisiting the trauma. When people come together to look at oppression, we revisit profound social trauma. We bring our complex identities and traumatic target and agent group experiences to the mix. We bring our hurt and shame and hope for honesty, healing, and redemption. The stakes are high. In this vulnerable atmosphere, our limbic and reptilian brains register the uneasiness. Our oppression survival patterns tend to become reactivized in our bodies and in the group space. It is important to remember that when agents and targets attempt to dialogue about oppression of any kind, of our lizard brains are present for the discussion. If our limbic and reptilian brains are in charge of the space, dialogues about oppression can swiftly become hurtful, re-traumatizing communications. There is the risk of oppression being recreated and reinforced by our complementary survival patterns. Encourage constructive healing discussions about oppression. It is important to cultivate an atmosphere of safety, compassion, and mindfulness, and to have tools at the ready to help us recognize and soothe our inevitable reactivity when it comes up. It is also important to practice creative, empowered responses to triggering situations, so our focus moves beyond survival reactions such as denial and blame into practicing and creating the loving and just environment and community that we all long for. Now, the last thing I want to mention is how to overcome oppression with power. When it comes to William Glasser, he says we all have 5 basic human needs. We need love and belonging, we need survival, we need freedom, we need power, and we need to have fun. Those are the 5 needs for human beings. That's what William Glasser breaks it down, just 5. That's all you need. You need to survive, you need love and belonging, you need freedom, you need to have power for yourself, you need to have fun. So overcoming oppression with a power. Here are some power strategies. Apart from resigning into depression, what can a low power group do when the dominant group is unwilling to negotiate a change in the status quo? Basically, there is only the possibility of increasing its relative power sufficient to compel the other to negotiate. Relative power is increased by either of 2 means: enhancing one's own power or decreasing the other's power. So you strengthen yourself or take away from their power. So how do you enhance your own power? Empowerment involves increasing one's possession of the resources on which power is based and increasing the effectiveness with which the power is used. I just want a side note. A lot of times if you diagnose yourself with low self-esteem, just make sure you're not surrounded by a bunch of assholes. That could give you a sense of low self-esteem when it's the people, the environment that you surrounded yourself with. Okay, so increase the effect. One can increase one's possession of the resources on which power is based and then increase the effectiveness with which the power is used. So they're saying self-empowerment is to get more resources so you have more resources to fight with, and then use a better effective strategy with how to use that power. Power is actually control of other people. That is how power traditionally has been used. But there's power for yourself, power to resist other people's will to power. Since we all got a will to power, we need to be around people that say, hey, knock it off. And if you care about one another, then, you should be able to get along. There are 3 areas to which those with low power can find additional resources: within oneself or one's group, within potential allies, and then within the oppressor themselves. So that's the 3 ways. And this is where Nelson Mandela actually was quoted from. But again, within your own self, within the group. I think I'll just kind of end it off on this, but essentially that's, when you have acknowledged that you're in a position of oppression, then you need to do something about it. You need to resist, you need to stand up or to remove yourself from the situation. You can methodically figure this out. Don't give up. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Keep that which is special in you, that individuality that is within you, keep it alive and keep it going. There are 3 areas in which those with low power can find additional resources. So yourself and other people. I think just by having other people kind of, looking out for you, that helps too. So you can increase the power for yourself. You can have conversations with other people, potential allies. And the last one is with the oppressor. Now, they go on through Nelson Mandela. He would resist when he was in prison. Yeah, he's in prison. He's behind the 4 walls. And they wanted them to, they're walking. Even though Nelson Mandela was still in prison, he would do 100 fingertip push-ups. So I guess just 200 sit-ups, push-ups on your fingertips, 200 sit-ups, 50 deep knee bends, and various other calisthenics. So he was keeping himself physically. He was also keeping himself in good shape mentally by reading widely, by becoming an informed expert on the laws and regulations concerning the treatment of prisoners, by studying for an LLB degree at the University of London. So they were in single file line, and the prison guards wanted them to start marching. And Nelson Mandela said, if we accept this, then they're going to be treating us like shit forever. So he was in the front of the line, and he just kept walking at the same pace. In fact, they said that he walked slower. And then they said, look, we will kill you. We're not fooling around. This is the last warning. And then he said, well, you have your duty. Nelson Mandela responded to the prison guards saying, hurry up and march faster, that you've got your duties and we've got ours. And so Nelson Mandela was determined that they weren't going to give in. And they didn't. They were already at the cells. So by his persistent public refusal to be humiliated or to feel humiliated, Nelson Mandela rejected the distorted, self-debilitating relationship that the oppressor sought to impose upon him. Doing so enhanced his leadership among his fellow political prisoners and the respect he was accorded by the less sadistic guards and wardens of the prison. So even though that person who was trying to be sadistic, the less sadistic guards they were impressed. Yeah, no, you don't need to just bully them around. Think about this Stanford prison experiments. Why were they submitting to those college students at all? Why did they do it at all? They knew it was an experiment, but they did it anyways. And when the Stanford prison experiments, when they submitted, that was the level of injustice. The prison guard who was actually, being a brutal sadist, was trying to see how far he could take this. So he was just seeing, he was just being an asshole and just seeing how far the other prisoners, and so essentially the level that they submitted to is the level of injustice that was perpetuated upon them. And because they identified with the oppressors, the one man who was actually doing the right thing with a hunger strike, trying to liberate them all, they turned against him because the oppressor says, I'm going to give you more punishment unless you get him in line too. And so they're like, man, just appease him, just do what he says, and then we'll get out of this. But that didn't work. The only way that would have worked is if they would have all done a hunger strike. And it was a college experiment. They would have got out. Now, in a prison environment, you could be disappeared, you could be killed, you could be tortured to death. So there's a higher stakes. Allies are very important. The acquisition of allies is central to enhancing the power of oppressed groups. Leader of the African National Congress of South Africa devoted considerable effort to developing allies among the leaders of their African nations, as well as among many other influential groups in the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and various industrial nations with economic ties to South Africa. There's little doubt that the Allies they developed played a crucial role in bringing about the ending of the apartheid system and the formation of a new government with Nelson Mandela as president and the ANC as a dominant political party. Their allies did this by bringing sufficient economic, political, and moral pressure upon the apartheid government to convince the economic leaders of the country that a change was necessary if they were to avoid an economic disaster. Unfortunately, sometimes oppressed groups do not sufficiently realize the important potential for allies among other oppressed groups. They narrowly define their interest in overcoming the injustice they are experiencing and not concerned with those being suffered by other. In the United States, for example, there is not an effective working coalition among such oppressed groups as blacks, gays, women, Hispanics, the disabled, poor, and the elderly, because these separate groups do not define their interests inclusively. While every group has to be for itself, when it is also for others, it becomes stronger from the support it receives. As Alinsky indicates, since the haves publicly pose as the custodians of responsibility, morality, law, and justice, which are frequently strangers to each other, they can be constantly pushing to live up to their own book of morality and regulations. No organization, including religion, can live up to the letter of its own book. So this is a good article. Just read the whole thing. He cites many examples of tactics in which bureaucratic systems were snarled in their own red tape by pressure to live up their own formally stated rules and procedures. Tactics of this sort may center upon demanding or using a service that one is entitled to, a service that is not ordinarily used so massively and for which the institution is not prepared to provide in large volume without excessive cost to itself. For example, banks may be disrupted by a massive opening and closing of accounts, department stores by massive returns of purchases, airports by massive use of their toilets and urinals by visitors, and so forth. or tactics may center upon disobedience to a rule or law that cannot be enforced in the face of massive non-compliance. Thus, landlords cannot afford to throw out all the tenants who refuse to pay rent in a cohesive rent strike, or schools to dismiss all students who disobey obnoxious school regulations if the students are united in their opposition. So that's just some tactics, and really it's all about tactics methodically. Just go methodically throughout. You have a problem and you want a solution. So what is the problem? Once you've identified the problem, I want to say that's half the battle. You've identified the problem. Now, do you resist? Do you fight it? Do you run away? Do you isolate? Don't appease? Don't appease and don't feel